Respond.
I wanted to say just a couple of things. First of all, to go back to the reading that Sonia Sanchez did, Pearl Buck's shadow, which is so real, reminds many of us, of course, who have read Dr. Du Bois of the veil. And the function of the veil was, and tragically in many cases still is, to prevent people from seeing what's there.
That's right.
And very specifically, in the case of his analysis, to prevent white America from seeing black America at all. The cultural work is extraordinarily difficult because a whole set of circumstances in which, among other things, patterns of residential segregation create schools that are themselves segregated, in which scholars will tell you that residential segregation in the North today is worse than it was 50 years ago, more extreme. It can lead to a kind of indifference that's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. It's down the street. When it gets on television in the most inflammatory ways without a sufficient context for explanation. I think ultimately it may involve a degree of dehumanization. I think Pearl Buck deserves credit, by the way, for using the word hate, because there's all kinds of euphemistic discussion that goes on in the conversation or the non-conversation or the euphemistic conversation about race in this country. And one of the places this conversation probably ought to occur and doesn't is in our leadership. It's a country whose political rhetoric from the very top, no matter what the race of the president, by the way, all the way down to our city council, doesn't want to talk about this. It doesn't want to talk about it either in economic terms or certainly in cultural terms. Ours is a culture, I'm afraid, of avoidance on this subject, as it is, by the way, on a lot of other subjects. Let's go invade a country about which we know nothing. How'll that be? Well, they'll cheer us as liberators. Well, they didn't. Yeah, if I could proceed from these comments to the detailed instructions on how to fix this, then I would.
I take it you're finished then. Thank you. That was amazing, that whole group response. I do want to ask you another question, Dr. Conn, in the context of Pearl Buck's position on race, and as Dr. Sanchez and Carrie read, how radical was she considered in her time?
In her time, but for those of you that aren't familiar with the biography, she died in 1973 at the age of about 80. So in her time, in a sense, in the United States, from the mid-30s through the mid-70s, is J. Edgar Hoover time. And whatever you know about J. Edgar Hoover, know this. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau was set up to catch criminals. With the exception of a couple of high-profile, carefully staged and choreographed arrests, that didn't occupy J. Edgar Hoover's interest. J. Edgar Hoover's second most violent interest was communism. His first most violent interest was civil rights. You got into his files, you got onto his watch list, you acquired surveillance because of your activities in civil rights. We do not have time here for me to go through with you the 350-page file that I secured from the FBI on Pearl S. Buck, most of which is about her civil rights activity. I'll just tell you one tiny anecdote. So she was actually followed, not continuously, but periodically. She was actually followed, and one of the reports in her file from an agent, a field agent in upstate Connecticut, said that she had, this in the late 40s, she was seen coming by train and visiting the Robesons, which of course that was very radical. And she signed into a hotel under an assumed name, which is obviously an admission of guilt. She signed in as Mrs. Richard Walsh, which was her name.
Her married name. Yeah.
That's great.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.